In the previous Soul Eater novel video, I covered Chapter 7, which covered Tir meeting Victor and their escape from Gregminster. In this video, I'll be covering Chapter 8. Chapter 8 covers the events of Tir meeting Odessa and the Liberation Army. If you remember from previous chapters, Tir never handed the Mount Seifu bandits over to Grady. He freed them himself after fighting them when he heard their story and learned of Grady's corruption. Because of that, there's no need to travel to Rockland to rescue them, so that scene has been completely cut, but there are new scenes and lots of new dialogue. This chapter plays out very differently from how it does in the game. And as always, I'll be doing no editing on these videos covering the novels. If a picture appears in the book, I'll put it up on screen while talking about that scene, but aside from that, treat these videos on the novels as an audio experience. Chapter 8: The Liberation Army. Tir and the others began their journey to Camp on foot. The journey would take about a week, and the three of them had left the capital without even preparing for the trip. At first, they were full of worries about food and sleeping outdoors, but Victor shouted at Gremio from a nearby field that he caught tonight's dinner and asking him to skin it. Sitting by the fire in the fading light, Tir, Cleo and Gremio turned to look as Victor came jogging over the field carrying a wild rabbit in his hands. Gremio reluctantly stood and began preparing to cook, but Tir ran over to Victor in high spirits. Tir was impressed and asked Victor how he caught it. Victor laughed and said he catches his breakfast, lunch and dinner, and you'll starve if you set out on a trip without knowing how to hunt. Thanks to the fact that Victor was a seasoned traveller, they were able to travel without a single discomfort. Tir learned various things from Victor while they travelled. Ways to skillfully catch rabbits, ways to fish, how to sleep comfortably outside sheltered from the rain. Victor taught Tir nearly everything he felt was essential for travelling. As time passed, Tir came to trust Victor, but there was one subject Victor remained silent on. No matter how many times Tir asked Victor where he was from, Victor would just laugh and tell him that's a story for another day, and never once spoke of his past or his origins. This bothered Gremio, who felt he couldn't trust Victor, but Tir felt this quirk just gave Victor a greater depth of character. When the four of them finally arrived in Camp, Victor turned to them and said he was going to go ahead and talk to the person he wants them to meet. He told them to go to the Kayaki Inn and give the innkeeper his name. Gremio wondered out loud who the person Victor wants them to meet is, and said he can't shake the feeling Victor is up to something. Tired from the long journey, Cleo responded that she couldn't care less and she just wants to take a hot shower. The three of them headed straight for the Kayaki Inn. The innkeeper seemed to be expecting them and led them to their room. The room was so large it seemed far too big for them. There were 4 wooden beds, a large table, and a comfortable chair sat by the window with a huge clock as tall as Tir standing in the corner. Gremio groaned this room must cost more potch than they all have as Tir dumped their bags and ran to the window. He opened the window and took a deep breath. It was the first time he really felt how far they had come from the capital. He looked out the window anew, and stretched out before him was a town he had never seen before. Even the wind seemed different. He felt like the smells it carried were different from Gregminster. Tir's heart had been fit to break when they left Gregminster, but while watching the people of Camp working in the sunlight, a thought formed in his mind that this might be fun. While waiting for Victor, Tir sat in the chair by the window to relax. Gremio looked into his purse and groaned at all the missing potch, and Cleo went to take a hot shower. She was gone for so long that Tir wondered what she could possibly be doing in there. The three then had a meal that rivaled Gremio's cooking, but still there was no sign of Victor. Cleo said they should rest and wait for him for a while, and if he doesn't show up they can go north to meet Lord Tio. The night wore on and the clock in the corner of the room began to chime. A voice whispered in between the chimes of the bell, "Hey Tir." Tir had already slipped into bed. He pushed aside the blanket and sat up and asked, "Is that you, Victor?" But Victor was nowhere to be seen. The clock kept chiming as Gremio lit a candle. It ceased after the 12th chime and they could hear the voice once more saying, "Over here, Tir." Tir turned in the direction of the voice. Gremio squinted and held up the candle, but the clock was the only thing there. Before their eyes, the clock slid to the side. As soon as the staircase underneath came into view, Victor popped up telling them to hurry up and come down. Climbing out of bed, Tir asked him down where and what's this hidden staircase. Tir had a funny feeling but followed Victor down the stairs. Cleo followed after and Gremio came last, muttering he knew Victor was suspicious. They walked down the stairs into an underground area, and Tir's body was engulfed by a cool, damp air. He could hear the faint sound of running water. Victor called back to Tir over his shoulder and told him to watch his step. Then Victor turned to face him, and Tir jumped in surprise without meaning to. Victor had vanished, and in his place stood a young woman with chestnut hair. Looking concerned, the woman commented that's a first and said to Tir she hopes her face isn't that ugly. Victor laughed and commented that Odessa is just so damn pretty that Tir jumped out of his skin. Odessa asked Victor if these are the new friends he told her about. Victor replied that's right, but just as he was about to tell Odessa who Tir is, Cleo's voice could be heard coming from behind Tir, asking Victor if this is the woman he wanted Tir to meet. Tir turned in surprise to find Cleo and Gremio standing behind him, glaring at Victor and Odessa. Cleo reached her hand behind her back and drew her knives. Before Tir could even ask her what she was doing, Cleo stepped forward with her knives held up and declared Odessa is the leader of the rebel army. Tir looked at Odessa in astonishment. Gremio took up his axe and moved in front of Tir. Tir told him to wait, but Gremio didn't stop. Gremio said to Victor he knew he was suspicious and he won't allow him to lay a finger on the young master. Cleo said it was stupid of them to get caught in a trap and declared she'll protect the young master with her life. Confused, Victor drew his sword and stood in front of Odessa to protect her, just as Gremio and Cleo stood at the ready in front of Tir. The two groups stood glaring at each other with their weapons at the ready, but then a young man with a blue cape came dashing out angrily, calling out Imperial soldiers. As the man's angry voice echoed in the waterway, another man in silver armour with a longsword in hand appeared. The man in the blue cape attacked Cleo and a fierce sword fight ensued. Cleo beat back his determined assault and Gremio leapt into the waterway, defending Tir against the reach of the other man's longsword. Tir, Victor and Odessa desperately tried to stop them. Before long, the sound of blades clashing had turned to endless heavy breathing. Exhausted, the four finally sheathed their weapons, reaching a ceasefire. Laying on the ground, Gremio panted while saying the young master could return to the capital if they captured you rebels. Tossing his sword aside, Victor called Gremio a dumbass and asked him if he really thinks he'd give him that victory. Odessa eyed the pair of them in disbelief and told them they're hot-headed. Then the smile returned to her face and she sat down next to Tir. She said she doesn't know what lies the Empire's been spouting about them and asked Tir if he thinks they seem like some terrible rebel army. Tir examined Odessa and the other two who had come rushing in. Odessa certainly didn't match the brutal rumours he had heard, and her two companions both seemed like highly skilled warriors. Tir commented that they don't. Odessa's eyes sparkled at Tir's comments. She said they call themselves the Liberation Army and asked Tir if he knows what that means to them. Tir asked, "Liberation?" Odessa replied that's right, but said this is no place to talk and asked her new comrades to follow her. Tir watched Odessa walk down the passageway, then used his staff to push himself up off the floor. He was curious about Odessa's words, Liberation Army and new comrades. Tir muttered to himself that he had no idea the Liberation Army was anything like this as he followed after Odessa. This next part is similar to the game. They all gather around the table, Flick, Humphrey and Sanchez introduce themselves, Odessa explains the Liberation Army and what their goals are. Tir tells them he's not happy with the Empire and he wants them to change their ways, but he can't join the Liberation Army. Flick and Victor get into a little back and forth because Victor sprung this on them without even asking them if they wanted to join first. Odessa told Tir not to worry, but he can't forget what he's seen with his own eyes or heard with his own ears. You know the scene, I'm not spending 5 minutes talking about it. Instances of the Empire's oppression flashed through Tir's mind. He thought of Rockland, he thought of Ted. Odessa's words burned into his mind, he sensed something in them, and he found her words to be true. Fascinated by Odessa and her philosophies, Tir left the Liberation Army hideout, thinking that he wanted to stay in Camp just a little while longer, but the desire to get to know Odessa and the Liberation Army was beginning to form in his heart. When he consulted Cleo and Gremio, their opinions were split. Gremio wanted to go north and meet with Tio, but Cleo wanted to stay and figure out their situation. With a 2-1 vote, the group stayed in Camp. The following day, Tir got a chance to speak with the members of the Liberation Army since they were also staying at the Kayaki Inn. Tir spent so much time meeting and speaking with so many different people that the night had grown late before he even knew it. Just as he returned to his room, Victor emerged from the hidden passage underneath the clock and told him that Odessa wants to speak to him. Tir followed Victor to the stairs, but Flick came up scowling and shoved Tir aside, telling him that he doesn't trust him. Victor told Flick to knock it off. Flick called Victor a fool and said he doesn't trust him either as he pushed past Victor and left the room. Tir followed Victor down the stairs, but he couldn't get Flick's words out of his head. He understood where Flick was coming from. The Liberation Army was an organization that had to avoid the Empire's attention. It was completely natural for Flick to be suspicious of Tir, who not only possessed an Imperial general of a father, but just happened to tumble into the Liberation Army's lap and then refused an invitation to join. At this point, Tir meets Odessa to have a chat, which is basically a combination of their conversations about Varkus and Sidonia and their scene in Sardi from the game, both of which are omitted from the novel. You know the scenes, I'm not spending 10 minutes going over those two conversations. Odessa also told Tir about Achilles, her former lover who the Empire killed. She told him that Achilles was once an aristocrat who was part of an anti-imperial resistance movement, but he was captured and sentenced to death. He was allowed a final request to marry Odessa, but the Imperials planned to execute him as soon as the ceremony was over. The moment Odessa's vows left her lips, she grabbed a sword from a nearby soldier and fought until her white dress was dyed crimson red. They took advantage of the confusion and tried to escape, but Achilles was hit by an arrow and died. She told Tir she's not fighting for her own revenge. When she fled the capital, she saw how the people suffered under the Empire's rule. She does what she does out of love, and she wants to build a country where everyone can smile and live happily. Odessa's words left Tir speechless. The look in her eyes as she spoke of the Empire was the same as Haruna's. Tir shared her sorrow, and he couldn't help but feel bitter as he mourned yet another person suffering at the hands of the Empire. Though Odessa's words fanned the flames of his anger towards the Empire, every time he tried to voice his decision, an image of his father appeared in his mind and pushed the words back down. Odessa tried to convince him to join the Liberation Army, but Tir told her he's still not sure. She thanked him for at least considering it and told him to take all the time he needs, but whatever choice he makes, he should listen to his heart. Odessa then flashed a smile at Tir and gently squeezed his hand. As Odessa turned to walk towards the stairs, Tir took a deep breath and wondered if he should stay or if he should go north to see his father. Odessa paused in front of the stairs and called out Tir's name. Tir ran to her side and asked her what's wrong. Odessa was gazing into the darkness of the waterway and asked Tir if he heard that noise just now. Tir listened carefully and could hear the sound of water splashing and dripping. It sounded like someone was approaching. Tir remarked, "It couldn't be. Imperial soldiers?" No sooner were the words out of his mouth than Odessa drew her sword. Something glittered in the dark of the waterway. It was the light of the swords being drawn by the Imperial soldiers advancing. Odessa and Tir took on the soldiers coming from the waterway. They couldn't attack all at once because the passage was so narrow, but there were too many for Tir and Odessa to handle. Tir shouted at Odessa to make for the stairs and escape, but right after he shouted, the passage opened and Victor's voice came rumbling from above. Victor shouted out, "Shit, Imperial soldiers." He then asked Odessa and Tir if they're okay. Odessa told him they're coming down from the waterway and they can't hold them off. Victor jumped down the stairs to help, then Flick's voice could be heard coming from the stairs asking Odessa if she's okay. Odessa told Flick to take the men and get out of town. Flick tried to argue, but Odessa insisted he go, reminding him that he's second in command. Victor kicked down the leader of the Imperial soldiers and roared he'll handle things here. Flick replied alright and told Odessa to stay safe. Odessa told him you too. Victor grasped their disadvantage as the enemy soldiers attacked them in waves. He told Odessa he'll hold them off while she escapes. Odessa refused to run and Victor called her a dumbass. He reminded her that she's the leader and everybody has their hopes pinned on her, that if she dies, so will the Liberation Army. Odessa's protests were cut short by her shriek. An Imperial soldier had crept in between her and Victor, and another soldier was between her and Tir. The three of them were now isolated from each other. Tir desperately swung his staff to try and get closer to Odessa, but a soldier in the waterway drew his sword and tripped him up. Victor leapt into the waterway, roaring at the soldier, calling him a bastard. He took down the soldier with a splash. His strength was such that he scattered the soldiers in the waterway too, and then jumped back up right in front of Tir, who was going to Odessa's aid. The Imperial soldiers didn't miss their chance to attack. 3 of them came up onto the passageway and blocked off the path to the stairs. Victor commented things aren't looking good and those bastards have them cornered. Victor growled at the soldiers as he slowly backed up. Tir asked Victor what are things like upstairs, and Victor responded it's like a bloodbath up there. Tir and Victor retreated to support Odessa. The soldiers climbed out of the water and rearranged themselves into formation. Victor roared at the soldier on the left, who moved back in fear. Tir shoved the soldier on the right, and Odessa took care of the one in the middle. They had pushed back the Imperial soldiers and gotten one step closer to winning the fight. Suddenly, Tir caught the gleam of arrowheads at the breast of one of the rearguard soldiers. Tir grit his teeth and took out the vanguard, but other soldiers immediately replaced them. While Tir was occupied, a soldier in the rear notched an arrow to his bow, drew and aimed at Tir. The bow sang as the arrow flew. Tir was knocked sideways into the wall just as Odessa called out his name. Tir called out Odessa's name and turned to look at her, but it was too late. An arrow was lodged in Odessa's chest. Victor and Tir took down the remaining Imperial soldiers with brute strength and then leaned over Odessa. The rest of the chapter plays out similar to the game. They offered to get Odessa a doctor, but Odessa said it's too late. Victor flew into a rage, saying the Liberation Army is nothing without her. Tir hung his head and apologized, saying it's all his fault. He saw the soldier with the arrow, but he couldn't stop him. Odessa told him it's not his fault. She made the choice she did because she knew Gremio and Cleo's hearts would break if that arrow hit him. Tir was astonished that the leader of the Liberation Army, the one everyone looked up to and put all their hopes and dreams on, would take an arrow for a boy she only met yesterday. Odessa told Tir she doesn't want to see anyone cry because of the Empire anymore. Odessa then asked 2 favors of Tir. The first, to take her earring and deliver it to a man named Matthew in Seika village, and the other to throw her body into the water. Tir and Victor protested at her horrible request. Odessa fixed her eyes on Tir and told him that if word of her death gets out, the movement will die, so they must hide her death to keep the hope alive. Tir gave a silent nod and Victor punched the ground in anger. Odessa asked Victor to tell Flick that his kindness always comforted her. She then turned her head to Tir and commented what a kind soul he is for shedding a tear for her even though they only met yesterday. She placed her blood-soaked hand atop Tir's right hand. In that moment, Tir felt the back of his hand grow warm, like Odessa's spirit was seeping into his hand. Odessa told him to remember his tears and her blood, that the blood and tears of many others will be spilt under the rule of the Empire. Tir gripped her hand tightly. All his thoughts were colliding in his heart. Silently, he shut his eyes and felt Odessa's pulse weaken. All the confusion in his heart quietened, and only one thought rose to occupy his mind. Tir then said to Odessa that he doesn't want to see any more blood or tears shed like this. Odessa smiled faintly as she thanked Tir and said she knew he'd agree. With her breath slowing, she told Tir to see the free world that she couldn't, and then her mouth closed. When Tir gently placed her hand on her chest, his heart was no longer filled with the image of his father. Instead, what filled his mind was only these words: choose the path you believe is right. And that's the end of chapter 8. This is quite a long chapter in the book. I skimmed over some parts because they were similar to the game, and if I covered them in depth it would have been a nearly 40-minute video. There were quite a few new scenes in this chapter. It showed the struggle Tir was facing. He was conflicted and torn between his love for his father, his idealized view of the Empire, and the horrible acts of the Empire he witnessed firsthand. He knew in his heart what was right and what he had to do, but he couldn't bring himself to make that step until he met Odessa. Don't worry about there being no mention of the fire spears in this chapter, that's all explained later in the story. In the next video I'll cover chapter 9, which is the final chapter in the first volume of the novelization. Chapter 9 covers Tir meeting with Matthew and taking over leadership of the Liberation Army. It also includes a brand new scene involving Ted and Windy. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.